Okay, now that we've talked about cases of rule inversion and cases where the loss of a rule from a grammar through its opacification leads to the creation of new phonemes, we can see a case in which rules are themselves restructured, aspects of their domain of application are altered slightly, and we'll call these cases of another type of rule change when the rules themselves are restructured. We'll use here another example from Old English, with which involving a process with which we're already partly familiar from our lecture on productivity, process of F voicing. So in late Old English, around say 1200 of the Common Era, all fricatives that were voiced in the language were in fact allophones of phonemic voiceless fricatives. So the two sounds fa and va would have been allophones of fa, and this distribution of these two phonemes, these two allophones, fa and va, was governed by a voicing rule, saying that the underlying voiceless fricative became voiced between two other voiced segments. So the two forms self and selves in the plural would have worked as follows. So in the singular, of course, nothing happens morphologically or phonologically, but in the plural, once the morphology first adds a suffix us in Old English here, then the voicing rule, call this intervoiced F voicing within a word. Once this rule was once this suffix is inserted, the conditions for the application of this rule are met, since this F now follows a voiced approximant and stands before a vowel. So just abbreviate this as F voicing. And the result is that then a voiced the arises here. So now the paradigm of this reflexive pronoun would look like self, singular, but selves, selvus, more precisely, selvus in the plural. And later in the history of English, a couple of further changes occurred so that we arrived to something closer to modern English forms. So first is that fricatives became voiced after unstressed vowels. When this occurs, this will give the new plural form with a z, so a fricative becomes voiced after an unstressed vowel, and the result is that selvus turns into selvus. And then subsequently, a schwa was lost in final syllables, like in the plural, so the schwa becomes 0 here, and this then will, in this word, give us the plural form selves. There's an important exception here, namely that if the schwa was located between two consonants that shared place and manner of articulation, the schwa was not deleted. So this gives rise to exactly another sort of rule inversion in the history of English. So in plural forms like kisses, giving present-day English kisses, and in past tense forms like patted, where the present-day past tense form could be patted in dialects with tapping, the schwa is not deleted because it's between sounds with the same place and manner of articulation, but rule inversion takes place because these forms where the suffix and the last consonant of the stem share place and manner of articulation were in the minority. What was originally a deletion rule becomes an insertion rule. We can think back to our analysis of our phonological analysis of the allomorphy of the English plural, which states that a vowel, some kind of centralized vowel like I, is inserted between two consonants sharing place and manner of articulation. Specifically with respect to the plural, we call this insertion between two sibilant segments, but we'll say that this rule applies when this insertion apply when you have two consonants sharing place and manner of articulation. I'll use a Greek variable abbreviation for place and manner features here to abbreviate this description. And this will generate, for instance, present-day English kisses from underlying kiss, the, and will generate present-day English patted or patted, depending on whether or not we apply tapping from underlying pat, duh. Notice in that case, of course, if tapping applies, that the schwa insertion or vowel insertion would need to take place before the tapping of the consonant. Now, as far as this voicing process in Old English is concerned, coming back to the Old English phenomenon, can also note in passing here that this voicing of fricatives is also responsible for other alternations between voiceless and voiced fricatives, which are in part simply lexically preserved in present-day English. So the adjective or noun half versus the verb have, to cut in half or break into two parts, has a difference in fricatives. So here we have, after these further surface forms were created through these processes of voicing of fricatives after non-stressed vowels and schwa deletion in final syllables, giving us plural forms like selves, we arrive to a situation in which the alternation between fa and va was largely confined to plural forms. And so later generations reanalyzed those alternations between fa and va. So the paradigm would now look like self, selves. The reanalysis is that we then have this rule of minor F voicing, which simply says that an F becomes voice after a voiced segment or rather after a voiced segment in noun plurals. And this creates the plurals of words like leaf, wife, and loaf in English, which have the plurals leaves, wives, and loaves, with voiced the in all cases. So what has happened is that originally there was a purely phonological rule, the intervoiced F voicing, which has been restructured as probably a morphologically sensitive rule of minor F voicing, which we just have discussed in previous weeks. And this means we can talk of a rule change because we've added these additional conditions to the rule such that it is a no longer completely productive phonological process. And moreover, the morphological process of plural formations diachronically has been restructured too. So originally, the plurals were built by adding a suffix us, schwa, s, and later the plural formation changes to simply adding a suffix s, or more precisely, this should actually read as a za. That is when the schwas are deleted. We should change this rule to a za here. Fix that in the handout. Because the schwa deletion eliminated the evidence, of course, for an underlying schwa in all of the plural forms. But of course, some plural forms were, as we discussed, protected from the schwa deletion, and the leftover schwas that originally belonged to the plural suffix were reanalyzed as a case of epenthesis, following a rule more or less as I've described here, the epenthesis of a schwa, or in between consonants sharing place and manner of articulation. Finally, in addition to the rule restructuring that we've just discussed, all of these developments then played a role in the emergence of another phoneme in English, namely a contrast between voiceless labiodental th and voiced labiodental v. In part, we find in present-day English that there are nominal stems that end in a voiceless th, which have plurals with voiceless th and voiceless s, like leaf, leafs, or surf, surfs. But the fact that the related verbs believe, the morphologically related verbs believe and serve, have voiced v, indicates that the v here may have already become phonemic in Old English. That is, the verbs had underlying phonemic v, whereas the nouns had underlying v, and no longer were involved in the voicing rule once this rule was restructured to become a minor rule. And the other major source for new phonemic v in English would have also been probably borrowings from Romance languages and Latin, which had this contrast. So words like Old French vil becoming English vile, which would have had a v in word initial position, which Old English could not have had, and new words with intervocalic voiceless f, like office, office in Old English. And I think it's pretty remarkable that even though this rule must have been restructured and had become a minor rule, which was specified as applying only to certain lexical items, the fact that it has persisted, continued to exist for some 500 years is fairly remarkable. So now that we've covered the sort of full extent of possible changes to rules and possible changes to underlying representations, let's think about the big picture a little bit. So the most important thing to keep in mind is that as the textbook says, children can only learn the phonology of their language on the basis of the data they actually hear. This means that a following generation of speakers, the children, can't acquire a rule if there's no alternation, that is, if there are no variable forms, or a complementary distribution of allophones or allomorphs to tell them that they need a phonological rule in order to explain the distribution of those sounds or the distribution of those allomorphs. So if we have rules that lack conditioning environments and the rules become obligatory, the next generation may fail to notice the cases where the rule didn't apply. And here, on a particular instance of such cases where a rule continues to spread beyond its original domain of application, you can see the article of Kiparsky's that I've suggested. And because grammars and underlying representations are psychological entities, when they really change, they must change suddenly when children go through the process of constructing what their phonological grammars and what their phonological underlying representations are. And this change occurs even if the surface forms themselves only change subtly or gradually, or seem to even remain the same. So in this way, I think that diachrony probably can be very useful for telling us a lot about the human language faculty. It probably sheds a great deal of light on how phonological systems are acquired and what sorts of preferences speakers have in building the phonology of their language. But the diachrony itself is not a very good guide to telling us how the synchronic phonology of a language really functions. when we want to analyze the synchronic phonology of a language, it's best to simply ignore the diachrony altogether, because sometimes knowing something about the earlier history of a language may lead us into analytical errors. So for instance, we wouldn't want to say that present day English really has a rule of intervoiced F voicing. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of exceptions to such a process. And we certainly wouldn't want to claim that contemporary Seoul Korean has any instances of an underlying tense vowel A. The important thing is that we need to analyze each synchronic system on its own. And then what is interesting and what can tell us something about human language in general is how those different synchronic grammars have changed over time. Okay, with that, we can close this lecture, and I hope to see you in the exercise session later this week. Take care.